Hey, Joseph with Landscape King, the Landscape King podcast. Today's episode is the 10 most commonly used plants in Baton Rouge. Now, these are the 10 most common plants we see when you're just driving around town in landscapes. It's also probably the most common plants that we use. We're going to have a few different episodes later on that talk about the 10 best shade plants, the 10 best perennials, the 10 best annuals, the 10 best yada, yada, yada. There's all kinds of different categories of plants, but this episode is specifically just the most commonly used plants. So first, we are a landscape company in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. We started in 2017. This is our Landscape King podcast. The objective of this podcast is to educate people about landscaping. Eventually, we're going to talk about business as well, and we just want to help people share what we've learned. This is what we've done. It may not work for everybody, but this is what we've done. So the first plant we're going to talk about is the knockout rose. Knockout rose and drift rose. These are great flowering plants. Sometimes when I tell people about, hey, let's do the knockout or the drift rose, they're like, oh, I don't want the thorns. And it is true, they definitely have thorns. You definitely don't want them right up on a sidewalk. But what's great about both of these, and there's all kind of varieties, the Floribunda, the hybrid tea, some older varieties of roses, but these are relatively new varieties of roses or cultivars of roses. And what's great about these is that they bloom spring through fall, and you don't have to deadhead them. We like to prune them. Most of the time with most roses, people say you want to prune them in February and just get that new growth coming out to where they start blooming. But with the knockout and the drift roses, you can prune these almost any time of the year. Now the knockout comes in red, comes in pink, there's a yellow, there's even a white now. What's really great about it, it does, like I said, it blooms spring through fall, and it can get about 4 to 6 feet tall. But when it's happy, it really needs full sun. But when it's happy, this thing is just gorgeous with flowers spring through fall. The drift rose is going to stay a little bit smaller. So if you got a little bit tighter area, you don't have enough room, I'd go with the drift rose. As far as roses go, they're relatively low maintenance. 4 to 6 times a year is when we're really saying you need to prune those. And that's because the more you prune these, the more they're going to keep blooming. And really with the knockouts, they can get leggy. So we want to make sure we're just pruning those to where they're nice and full of flowers, because that's what we want with those things. And with the drift roses too. So they're going to get about 2 to 3 feet tall, 2 to 3 feet wide. And you can keep them a little bit smaller than that as well. So knockout drift roses. The next plant you're going to see a lot in the Baton Rouge landscape is Distillium. You're definitely going to see these at McDonald's. The company that designs and installs those, they use those all the time. I feel like it is a relatively new plant. Whenever I was working at Clegg's many years ago, it wasn't super popular, but now it's just become very popular as just a dwarf evergreen shrub. And we find that it's one of the most durable plants. When a client comes and says, hey, I've got this area, I don't know what I can plant here. It's either full sun, partial shade. I've tried all these other things. I'm like, hey, let's try Distillium. Because it really, and there's many different varieties of Distillium too that can get different sizes as well. So we have Vintage Jade, Cinnamon Girl, Swing Low, and those are going to be kind of the 3 to 4 feet wide as well. 3 to 4 feet tall, 3 to 4 feet wide. And then there's one called Linebacker that we've started using as more of a privacy hedge. And it can get 6 to 8, maybe even like 10 feet tall as well. And that one's, what's nice about the Distillium is it's evergreen. It doesn't bloom a very showy flower, but it does have a small red flower that people like. What's also nice about it is it has more of a loose growth habit to it. Sometimes with like the linebackers, we have some at a few clients' houses that we've planted really tight together and we just shape them up. But it could be a really nice specimen plant that kind of has that loose look to it. Some people like that. Some people want it to be very sharp and manicured. So Distillium, many varieties of that we can use as well. The next plant, number 3. So the Japanese yew. Great plant for a hedge. Yeah, it can be toxic to dogs, but they've got to eat a whole lot of it. you see it everywhere. Everybody plants this plant. I don't know if they don't know that, but we use it too. It's just a great hedge. It's hard not to use it. There is a dwarf variety of the Japanese yew that's called a Pringle. And then there's just the regular Japanese yew that it can get like 10 to 12 feet tall. It may even be able to get big. I've seen them get bigger as well in just time over the years. But a lot of times people kind of keep them manicured at like 6 to 8 feet tall. And then the Pringle is more like a 3 to 4 feet. So there is an option there. Number 4, the variegated flax lily, or Dianella. And I'm just giving you the common names. I'm not going to give you the botanical names. You don't need to know that. You just need to know the common names and what people call them. So variegated flax lily is just this white and green, let's call it a leafy, airy plant. And if you saw a picture of it, you'd be like, oh yeah, I see that everywhere, especially in the Baton Rouge landscape. We really like this plant to give you a contrast of color. So it's white and green. And so especially in front of plants like the Japanese yew or the Distillium, it just really pops. And then if you have a landscape that everything is just dense shrubs, it's nice to have something that's kind of loose. It's got a different leaf texture to it. And that color is really nice too. Number 5 is the Foxtail fern. And this one's the same kind of thing. This one's going to be more of a loose plant. Now with the variegated flax lily, it does die back in the winter. And in the middle of the winter, these things look totally dead. And we've had people dig them out thinking they were dead, but you don't need to dig them out. You just need to cut them back. They do come back easily. Variegated flax lily and foxtail fern are both like that. They both just need to be cut back in the winter, and then they come back really nice from the roots. And you see both of these. And really, I'd say like 2 to 3 feet on both of the. I've never seen a foxtail 3 feet, but maybe 2.5. Same with the variegated flax. And both of them the variegated flax will kind of clump, but when you cut them back, you can keep them individualized too. And same with the foxtail. But it's nice to plant them. You would often see them planted in a large mass. Around the oaks at LSU, there's an area where they have like 150 of these by the engineering building. They have a whole bunch of them under some trees, and they look really cool. So foxtail fern, there's also asparagus fern that looks like the foxtail. And then there's all kind of ferns you would see in the Baton Rouge landscape as well. The next, number 6, is a camellia. So we have the Camellias sasanquas and the Camellia japonicas. And going back on these, the knockout's going to like full sun. The Distillium can do full sun to partial shade, partial sun. Japanese yew, full sun, partial shade, partial sun. Same with the variegated flax. The foxtail can really take more shade than probably any of the other ones. The foxtail also can take a little bit more, if the area doesn't drain super well, they can handle more wet feet. These others really need, especially the Japanese yew, is really going to need well-drained soil. So camellias are also going to like well-drained soil. The Camellia japonicas do great in the shade. If you put them in full sun, they might get acclimated, but not really. I'd really put them in shade. The sasanquas can handle a little bit more sun. With both the sasanquas and the japonicas, there's all different kind of size varieties that we can get. We have some, like for the sasanqua, we have the shishi, which is probably the most common you see in the Baton Rouge landscape, especially in a commercial landscape. It's just a dwarf evergreen shrub. And what's really nice about camellias is they bloom in the late fall, early winter. So that's why we try to couple them with like the knockout rose or the anything else that's blooming in the spring and fall, to where we have something that's blooming almost every season. So camellias, Camellia sasanqua and Camellia japonica. The difference is sasanquas can handle the sun more. The japonicas are going to have bigger leaves most of the time. They're also going to have bigger flowers. Now, these are beautiful flowers. They almost look like the rose of the winter. Japonicas are really going to prefer the shade. Sasanquas are going to really like that. They're going to handle that full sun better. So number 7 are hollies. And so there's all different kind of hollies you'd see in the Baton Rouge landscape. A lot of them are going to be like a tree form, or standard form is what they call it. So like Eagleson, East Palaca, Dahoon, Savannah, all of these are most of the time going to be pruned to where they have a single trunk and then they're just green on top, almost like a Christmas tree. And most of them do make berries, and they're evergreen. And then we have like the Oakland, the Nellie R. Stevens, More common with these, you're going to see them full to ground. So that's just it's really going to look like a Christmas tree. These are great in a formal landscape and a low maintenance landscape. These are just great focal points. If you have a corner that you want something to just fill it and complement the architecture of your home, that looks really great. Then we have other hollies that have soft leaves on them. The compacta holly, the dwarf yopon, and the soft touch. And these are going to be more of, all three of those are used as a substitute for the boxwood. And we talked about the boxwood a little bit, but basically right now, everybody's worried of planting the boxwood because there's a blight, a fungal disease, a nematode. There's all of these issues that could potentially happen to those. You can have the same issues with these, but oftentimes the dwarf yopon is going to be the most resilient that we see. If you're looking for that formal look like we talked about with the Japanese yew, where you just want a hedge that goes around the perimeter of the bed, you would see the compacta, the dwarf yopon, or the soft touch instead of the boxwood. You also see the boxwood in Baton Rouge too. But I really like the dwarf yopon a lot. It almost looks like, if you don't shape it up, it has more of a meatball shape, kind of that globed shape. These are very common in the Baton Rouge landscape. The dwarf yopon is just one of the most resilient plants you can plant. Yopon is a native plant. You would often see like not the dwarf, but there's the yopon growing in the woods as well. So the next we have, and with all of these, most of them they're gonna do well in full sun. So another holly you would see would be the Buford holly. There's a dwarf Buford. There's Hello Rye. There's maybe a few others that you would see planted in a landscape, but these are the most common, the Eagleson and the Savannah. And then what we use the most is we really like the Oaklands. Oakland or oak leaf, just full to ground holly, really great. Next is hydrangeas. So this plant is really not, most of the time, most hydrangeas are not going to perform well in full sun. Now there are some, like the limelight, it blooms a white flower. It has a little bit different flower structure than the other hydrangeas. The kind of the traditional, like the one that looks more like the traditional purple or blue is Endless Summer, and there's all kind of different other varieties as well. But limelight can handle full sun better than some of the other ones, but most hydrangeas are gonna like the sun. I mean, like the shade. Now, hydrangeas do lose their leaves in the winter. What's nice about hollies is they're evergreen. Same with the camellias. Most of the things we've talked about have been mostly evergreen, except for variegated flax lily, foxtail fern, and hydrangeas. Hydrangeas are a deciduous shrub, which just means they lose their leaves in the wintertime. But beautiful flowers in the summertime. Lots of different options of colors, of sizes. Really, really good plant. And you see this is very common in the Baton Rouge landscape. The next is the southern magnolia. So we're talking about D.D. Blanchard, Little Jim, Teddy Bear. These are all southern magnolias that range from 80 to 100 feet tall down to 15 to 20 feet tall. I hear this so often that, I bought this dwarf magnolia and it's not a dwarf. It got way too big. Because dwarf in this sense is relative, and what it's really talking about is it's not going to get 80 to 100 feet tall. It's going to get 15 to 20 feet, which in most people's minds, they think dwarf, they think like 4 to 6 feet. And that's just not the case with the Little Jim magnolia. Little Jim is still going to get big, but not as big as the D.D. Blanchard. That's why it's considered a dwarf. I love the southern magnolia. I go on these phases of different plants that I'm like really into. If a client doesn't like the holly, my next choice for them is southern magnolia. Now, not right up on the house, but like the corner focal point or out in the yard. Most of the time, they're going to look full to ground. Sometimes you'll shape up the bottom to where it's got the multi-trunk or even a single trunk, and then it's just full on the top. But southern magnolia, really cool plant. Very, very common in the landscape here in Baton Rouge. The next, number 10, is Liriope or Liriope or Lirio or everybody says this a different way. A lot of people they just lose the P. They just call it Lirio. That's such a common thing that people, I want that Lirio. I'm like, oh, Liriope or Liriope. And working at Clegg's, I think we called it Liriope, and then other people call it Liriope. But it's mostly what people are referring to is border grass. Now, there is monkey grass, too. That's actually, I believe it's a type of Liriope as well. But Liriope is going to be, or Liriope, see, and I'm always saying it two different ways, but it's going to be mostly a border grass plant that you would plant in front of the bed perimeter. What we really like, there's one called Evergreen Giant Liriope that we've even used, like instead of doing the boxwood to border around the perimeter of the bed, we do the Evergreen Giant Liriope. It gets 2 to 3 feet tall, 2 to 3 feet wide. It is evergreen, like it says. But sometimes you'll have some brown tips, and sometimes you'll have some stuff that you need to clean out. But still a really great plant. So these are just 10 most common plants you see in the Baton Rouge landscape. 10 most commonly used plants in Baton Rouge is what we're titling this. Not that you have to use these plants, but this is what you're going to see the most common. And I believe these are most common because these are some of the most resilient plants we see. We don't have issues with many of these. The only thing you might have an issue with is hydrangeas if you plant them in the wrong spot, or same with japonicas if you plant them in the wrong spot. And most of these are not bulletproof, but if you prepare the beds and you put these in the ground in the right spot, they do really well. So there are different categories of plants. There's evergreens, there's perennials, annuals, tropicals, and then you can further classify them as well, but for the sake of just knowing a little bit more about your landscape, evergreens are what they sound like. They don't lose their leaves in the wintertime. Deciduous plants lose their leaves in the winter. So you have deciduous trees and you have deciduous shrubs as well. So the hydrangea is a deciduous shrub as well. Then you have perennials and you have annuals. Perennials live for a season, die for a season, or go dormant, whatever you want to call it, and then come back the next season. Okay, so we have lots of warm season perennials. We even have, in Baton Rouge, we don't really have that many cool season perennials, but we mostly would have cool season annuals and warm season annuals. And annuals live for a season and they don't come back. The next is tropicals. Tropicals can kind of be used as annuals, that we're like planting them in the bed with the expectation that they're not going to make it in the winter. We're going to pull them out and we're going to replace it. Where you go geographically around the nation, different things are annuals and different things are perennials. So things that are annuals here in Baton Rouge don't ever die back in South Florida. And we talked about that in another episode, but it's crazy. You go to South Florida and you see Schefflera used like it's just a normal plant in the landscape, or the crotons just planted out there, the rubber plant just out in the shaded landscape. Blows my mind, but pretty cool stuff. So those are kind of some different categories. Some other things we're going to talk about, some other episodes we're going to have, and I said that in the beginning, but the 10 best shade-loving plants in Baton Rouge. Oftentimes when people have shade, their expectation is that they can't plant cool things, but sometimes a shade garden is the coolest garden because we can have a lot of big leafy green things. We can plant like the weeping Japanese maple, which are really cool plants too. They have that red leaf. Lots of really cool options in Baton Rouge for shade-loving plants. Another thing is the 10 best flowering shrubs. One of those would be that knockout rose. It's going to give you a lot of bang for your buck. The dwarf camellia, the shishi, that's going to give you that late fall, early winter. It's a really cool plant. Some really cool plants. So the shishi's a really cool plant. Other topics, 10 best low maintenance plants, 10 best warm season annuals, perennials, yada, yada, yada. You get it. We're going to talk about plants. The Landscape King podcast. If you got questions about what you can do in your landscape, if you got questions that you want us to talk about on this podcast, just ask us. Send us an email. Send us a message. Joseph with Landscape King. Let's plant some plants.